Welcome to another spine-chilling tale of supernatural warfare and ancient bloodlines. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next in this epic saga. Chapter 1. The desperate plea, the message arrived at dawn, carried by a raven whose black feathers were stained with blood that wasn't its own. King Aldrich Blackmane caught the bird with one massive hand, his golden eyes scanning the hastily scrawled words that would change everything. Your Majesty, we are dying. The northern pack of Ironridge is under siege. We've lost half our warriors in 3 nights. Send us anything, anyone. We're getting slaughtered. Elder Thorn, last of the Ironridge Council. The parchment trembled in the Alpha King's grip, not from fear, but from the barely contained rage that made his wolf stir beneath his skin. Ironridge was a remote pack, yes, but they were his people. Every wolf in the northern territories fell under his protection, and someone, or something, was systematically destroying them. The throne room of Shadowmere Castle had witnessed countless moments of crisis over the centuries. But the silence that followed Elder Thorn's plea was different. It carried the weight of impending doom, the kind that made even the most seasoned warriors shift uncomfortably in their positions. Ancient tapestries depicting legendary battles seemed to watch from the walls, their woven heroes frozen in eternal combat against forces that paled in comparison to whatever was hunting in the northern mountains. My lord? Beta Commander Marcus stepped forward, his scarred face grave. The old warrior had served 3 generations of Alpha Kings, and his instincts were rarely wrong. Shall I ready the war parties? Aldrich's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. The expression was one his enemies had learned to fear. It meant the Alpha King was about to do something unexpected, something that would shift the balance of power in ways no one could predict. No, Marcus. This requires a different approach. The throne room fell silent, except for the crackling of torches against stone walls. The assembled council exchanged worried glances. When the Alpha King spoke in that tone, it usually meant someone was about to face a fate worse than death. The last time they'd heard it, an entire rogue pack had been wiped from existence in a single night. Summon Kael Ashworth, Aldrich commanded, his voice echoing through the vast chamber like thunder rolling across distant peaks. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Even Marcus, who had served the crown for 30 years and thought himself beyond surprise, couldn't hide his shock. The name Kael Ashworth was whispered in the same breath as legends, a beta who had single-handedly changed the course of battles, who had tracked enemies across impossible terrain, who had faced down threats that would make alphas think twice, but it was also a name associated with tragedy. Everyone in the room knew the story of the warehouse fire 3 years ago, how Kael had lost his mate and pup while following orders to secure a perimeter. How he'd emerged from that night a changed wolf, colder, more distant, carrying a guilt that seemed to eat at him from the inside. My lord, Marcus ventured carefully, his voice dropping to the respectful tone reserved for questioning royal decisions. Surely you don't mean to send a single beta. I mean to send that beta. Aldrich's eyes flashed with an inner fire that made the air around him shimmer with barely contained power. Kael isn't just any warrior. He's the wolf who single-handedly held the Eastern Pass against 100 rogues. The one who tracked the Shadowmere Pack's assassins across 3 territories and brought me their heads. If anyone can discover what's hunting our people in Ironridge, it's him. The massive oak doors groaned open with the sound of ancient hinges protesting their weight. Kael Ashworth entered with the fluid grace of a predator, his footsteps silent on the stone floor despite his considerable size. At 6'4", he was tall even for a werewolf, his dark hair pulled back to reveal a face marked by battle and hardened by loss. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of the night he'd lost everything that mattered to him. But it was his eyes that made even the bravest alphas step aside. Storm gray and utterly cold, they held the kind of emptiness that came from having nothing left to lose. They were the eyes of a wolf who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back, who had made peace with darkness because light had proven too painful to bear. Kael's presence changed the atmosphere in the room. Conversations died mid-sentence. Warriors who had faced down armies found themselves unconsciously stepping back. There was something about him that spoke to the primal part of every wolf's brain, the part that recognized a killer when it saw one. Kael dropped to one knee before the throne, his head bowed in perfect submission. The gesture was flawless, practiced, but those who knew him could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand instinctively rested near the silver blade at his hip. Even in the presence of his king, Kael Ashworth was ready for violence. "You summoned me, my king." "Rise, Kael." Aldrich studied his most lethal beta with something approaching paternal concern. In the 3 years since the fire, he'd watched one of his finest warriors slowly hollow himself out, using duty and violence as a shield against grief. "I have a mission for you. The Northern Pack is under attack. They've lost half their numbers in 3 nights. Kyle's expression didn't change, but his nostrils flared slightly, the only sign that his wolf had stirred at the scent of potential violence. It was a reaction that had become automatic over the years, his beast eager for any distraction from the constant ache of loss. "What are your orders?" "Travel to Ironridge. Assess the threat. Eliminate it." Aldrich leaned forward, his voice dropping to a growl that resonated with alpha authority. "And Kael, I don't care what you find up there. Bring our people home alive." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the room understood the subtext. This wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a test, a chance for redemption, or perhaps a final assignment for a wolf who had been walking the edge of self-destruction for 3 years. Understood. Kael straightened, already calculating travel time and supply needs. His mind worked like a military strategist's, cataloging threats and resources with mechanical precision. "When do I leave?" "Now." As Kael turned to go, Aldrich's voice stopped him. "One more thing. Take this." The Alpha King tossed him a silver pendant bearing the royal seal, its surface inscribed with runes that seemed to shift and move in the torchlight. "If you encounter anything unusual, break it. I'll know." Kael caught the pendant, feeling the weight of ancient magic thrumming through the metal like a heartbeat. The runes were warm against his palm, and for a moment he could swear he heard whispers in a language older than civilization. Whatever was happening in Ironridge, his king expected it to be beyond the scope of normal pack politics. Perfect, Kael thought grimly as he secured the pendant around his neck. Normal had never been his specialty anyway. The journey to Ironridge took 2 days of hard travel through increasingly treacherous mountain terrain. Kael moved in his wolf form for most of it, a massive gray beast with silver markings that seemed to absorb moonlight. His wolf was built for endurance rather than speed, with powerful shoulders and jaws that could crush bone. The animal was a reflection of its human counterpart, efficient, deadly, and utterly without mercy. The mountains themselves seemed to grow more hostile the farther north he traveled. Ancient pines towered overhead like silent sentinels, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the sky. The air grew thin and cold, carrying scents that made his wolf uneasy. Old magic, spilled blood, and something else that had no name but made every instinct scream danger. As he climbed higher into the northern peaks, the scents began to change in ways that defied explanation. The usual markers of pack territory, scent posts, patrol routes, the comfortable musk of wolves going about their daily lives, faded into something else entirely. The very air seemed tainted, as if something unnatural had passed through and left its mark on everything it touched. Fear, pain, and underneath it all, something that made his wolf whine and pace restlessly in his mind. Death. But not just death. Something wrong. The wrongness grew stronger with each mile, until even the wildlife seemed to have fled the area. No birds sang in the trees. No small animals rustled through the underbrush. Even the insects had gone silent, leaving only the sound of wind through empty branches and Kael's own breathing to break the oppressive quiet. Kael shifted back to human form as he crested the final ridge overlooking Ironridge territory. What he saw made his blood run cold and his wolf retreat deeper into his mind, whimpering like a frightened pup. The village below was a graveyard. Houses stood empty, their doors hanging open like screaming mouths. Clothes fluttered on abandoned washing lines, the fabric moving in a wind that carried the stench of decay and something far worse. A child's toy lay forgotten in the dirt, its bright colors obscene against the backdrop of devastation. Gardens that should have been thriving in the summer sun were withered and black, as if the very life had been drained from the soil. But it was the silence that truly unnerved him. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the very air was afraid to make noise. The absence of life was so complete it felt like a physical weight. Pressing down on his chest, Kael's enhanced hearing picked up the faint sound of breathing. From the largest building and the pack, house, survivors, at least some had made it. But even that small comfort was tainted by the knowledge that whatever had done this was still out there, still hunting. He approached carefully, every sense on high alert. The scents here were a chaotic mess of terror, blood, and something else. Something that made his wolf recoil in instinctive revulsion, an odor that spoke of corruption and ancient malevolence, of things that should have remained buried in the deepest, darkest places of the world. Ancient, hungry, wrong. The pack house door was barricaded from the inside, heavy furniture stacked against it in a desperate attempt to keep something out. Kael knocked, 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. The traditional code for friend approaching. Silence stretched for long moments, broken only by the sound of whispered conversations and muffled sobs from within. Then a voice cracked with exhaustion and barely controlled terror. "Who goes there?" Kael Ashworth, Beta of the Royal Guard, sent by King Aldrich. The sound of furniture being dragged away from the door seemed to take forever. When it finally opened, it revealed an elderly man whose gray hair was matted with blood and whose eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much death. His clothes were torn and stained, and he moved with the careful precision of someone nursing multiple injuries. "Elder Thorn?" Kael asked, though he already knew the answer. The old wolf's scent was familiar from pack gatherings, though it was now overlaid with fear and exhaustion. The old man nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. "Thank the moon you came. Though I fear you may have come too late." Inside, Kael counted 12 survivors huddled in the main hall. Women, children, and a handful of injured warriors. All that remained of what had once been a thriving pack of nearly 60. They looked up at him with a mixture of hope and despair, their faces gaunt with hunger and terror. The pack house itself told a story of desperate defense. Furniture was overturned and stacked against windows. Claw marks scored the walls. Dark stains on the floor spoke of battles fought and lost. The air was thick with the scent of fear sweat and old blood. "Tell me what happened," Kael said, accepting a cup of bitter coffee from a woman whose hands shook as she poured. The liquid was cold and tasted of desperation, but he drank it anyway, knowing these people had little enough to share. Elder Thorn sank into a chair that creaked under his weight, his movements those of a man far older than his years. "It started 4 nights ago. We heard howling from the deep woods, but not wolf howling. Something else. Something that made our wolves cower and whimper like pups. One of the warriors, a young man with his arm in a makeshift sling and bandages covering half his face, spoke up. We sent a patrol to investigate. They came back wrong. Wrong how?" Kael's voice was sharp, cutting through the fear that seemed to permeate the very air. "Their eyes," the warrior whispered, his good hand trembling as he reached for his coffee cup. "Black as pitch. And they moved like they were being controlled. They attacked their own packmates. We had to—" He swallowed hard, unable to finish the sentence. Elder Thorn nodded grimly. "We had to put them down. Our own people. Our own family." His voice broke slightly on the last word. "The next night, more of our people went missing. We found them the following dawn, drained of blood but still breathing. Still walking. Still hunting." Kael felt ice form in his veins. The description was impossible, yet he'd seen enough supernatural threats to know that impossible didn't mean untrue. "You're describing thralls." "Aye," Thorn said. "But thralls to what?" We've never seen their master, only heard its voice on the wind, calling our people into the darkness, promising them peace, an end to pain, if they would only come closer. A child's scream pierced the night air outside. Every head in the room snapped toward the sound. But Kael was already moving, his hand on the silver blade at his hip. The scream had been high and pure, filled with the kind of terror that only children could produce. But there was something else in it, something that made his skin crawl. "That's impossible," one of the women breathed, her face pale as moonlight. "All the children are here. All of them are—" The scream came again, closer this time. And with it, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, carried on a wind that smelled of grave dirt and ancient malice. "Send me the king's dog. Send me the broken beta. I have such wonderful things to show him." Kael's blood turned to ice water. Whatever was out there, it knew who he was. It had been waiting for him, watching him approach, planning this moment. The realization that he'd walked into a trap should have terrified him. Instead, he felt only a cold, familiar anger. "Bar the doors!" he commanded, his voice cutting through the rising panic like a blade. "Don't let anyone in or out until I return." "You can't go out there alone," Elder Thorn protested, struggling to his feet despite his injuries. "Whatever's hunting us, it's not natural. It's not something one wolf can face." Kael was already at the door, his hand on the handle. He looked back at the terrified faces watching him, and for just a moment, his mask of cold professionalism slipped. They saw the pain he carried, the guilt that drove him, the desperate need to save someone, anyone, after failing to save the ones who mattered most. "I've been alone for 3 years," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every nightmare, every moment of crushing guilt. "I'm used to it." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving the survivors to huddle in the darkness and pray that the king's broken beta was enough to save them all. Outside, something laughed in the shadows, a sound like breaking glass and dying dreams. And Kael Ashworth walked toward the sound, silver blade gleaming in the moonlight, ready to face whatever ancient evil had come to claim his people. But was he walking toward salvation? Or his own damnation? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for Chapter 2, where Kael faces the true horror lurking in the Ironridge Mountains. What do you think is controlling the missing pack members? Let me know in the comments below. Chapter 2, The Hunt Begins. The child's scream led Kael deeper into the forest than any sane wolf would venture. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked out the moon, leaving only fragments of silver light to guide his way. But Kael didn't need light to hunt. His wolf senses painted a clear picture of his surroundings, every scent, every sound, every shift in the air currents. The forest itself seemed wrong. Trees that should have been centuries old showed signs of rapid decay, their bark blackened and peeling as if diseased. The undergrowth was sparse and sickly, with patches of earth that looked scorched despite no evidence of fire. Even the air tasted different here, metallic and bitter, with an underlying sweetness that reminded him of rotting fruit. What he found made him question his sanity. The child stood in a clearing ahead, her back to him. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with golden hair that caught what little moonlight filtered through the canopy. She was singing softly to herself, a lullaby that should have been innocent, but somehow sounded like a funeral dirge in the oppressive silence of the woods. The melody was familiar, something his own mother had sung to him as a pup. But hearing it here, in this place of death and wrongness, made his skin crawl. The notes seemed to hang in the air longer than they should, echoing off the trees in ways that defied natural acoustics. "Little one," Kael called softly, not wanting to startle her. His voice sounded strange in the unnatural quiet, muffled and distorted as if the very air was absorbing the sound. "What are you doing out here?" "It's not safe." The child stopped singing. Slowly, impossibly slowly, she began to turn around. The movement was wrong, too fluid, too controlled for a frightened child. It was the movement of something that had all the time in the world and knew exactly what it was doing. Kael's hand tightened on his silver blade as he caught her scent. Beneath the expected smell of fear and innocence was something else, something that made his wolf recoil in horror, and his human mind struggle to process what his senses were telling him. Decay. Ancient magic. And underneath it all, the cloying sweetness of corruption. When the child finally faced him, Kael understood why the survivors had spoken of wrongness. Her eyes were indeed black, not just the pupils but the entire eye, as if someone had filled them with ink. Her skin was pale as moonlight, with dark veins visible beneath the surface like a roadmap of infection. But it was her smile that truly chilled him, too wide, too knowing, filled with an intelligence that no 8-year-old should possess. But she was still breathing, still moving, still smiling with a child's innocent joy that was somehow the most terrifying thing Kael had ever seen. "The master said you would come," she said in a voice that was too old, too knowing for her young face. The words carried an accent he couldn't place, something ancient and foreign that made his ears ring. "He's been waiting for you, Beta Ashworth. Waiting and watching and remembering." "Remembering what?" Kael asked, though every instinct screamed at him to run. His wolf was pacing frantically in his mind, whimpering and snarling in equal measure. The animal wanted nothing more than to flee this place, to put as much distance as possible between them and whatever was wearing the child's face. The child tilted her head, and Kael heard the wet sound of vertebrae popping. The movement was too far, too extreme. No human neck should bend at that angle. "The night you failed them. The night you let your mate and pup burn while you followed orders like a good little soldier." The words hit Kael like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at the wounds he'd spent 3 years trying to heal. His vision went red around the edges, and his wolf surged forward with a snarl of rage. But beneath the anger was something worse, the crushing weight of truth. 3 years ago, the warehouse fire. Orders to secure the perimeter while his family was trapped inside. By the time he'd broken protocol and rushed in, there had been nothing left but ash and the smell of burned flesh. The memory played out in perfect, agonizing detail. Elena's terrified screams echoing through the smoke. Little Marcus crying for his daddy. The sound of burning timber and his own voice shouting orders to wolves who were already dead. The moment he'd realized that duty and honor meant nothing when the people you loved were dying. He knows everything about you, broken Beta. The child's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. Your guilt, your pain, your desperate need to save everyone because you couldn't save the ones who mattered most. He can take it all away. The pain, the memories, the crushing weight of failure. All you have to do is kneel. For a moment, just a moment, Kael was tempted. The promise of peace, of an end to the nightmares that plagued his sleep, and the guilt that ate at his soul like acid, was almost irresistible. To finally stop, carrying the weight of Elena's disappointed eyes, of Marcus's final, terrified cry, to be free of the constant ache that had become his only companion. Then he remembered the survivors huddled in the pack house, the terror in their eyes, the trust they'd placed in him despite knowing he was just one man against an unknown enemy. They were counting on him, just as Elena and Marcus had counted on him. The difference was, this time he had a choice. "I've got a better idea," Kael said, raising his silver blade. The metal caught what little light filtered through the canopy, gleaming like captured starlight. "Why don't you tell your master that I'm not interested in his gifts, and that if he wants me, he can come and take me himself?" The child's laugh was like breaking glass, sharp and discordant in the unnatural silence. "Oh, he will. But first, he wants to play." She raised one small hand, and the forest around them erupted into chaos. They came from every direction. Wolves that had once been members of the Ironridge pack, their eyes black as pitch and their movements wrong, jerky, like marionettes controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Kael counted at least 15, including several he recognized from pack photos in the village. Warriors he'd known by reputation, elders who'd served their pack with honor for decades, all reduced to shambling mockeries of their former selves. But it was the sounds they made that truly horrified him. Not the howls of wolves or the growls of predators, but something else entirely. A keening wail that spoke of endless suffering and lost hope. They moved as one, their individual personalities, subsumed into a collective consciousness that served only one purpose: to feed. The first one reached him before he could fully process the threat. It had been a young warrior named Derek, barely past his first shift. Kael remembered him from the last pack gathering. Eager, brave, full of life and promise. Now it moved. With inhuman speed, its claws extended and its jaw unhinged like a snake's, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that had never belonged in a wolf's mouth. Kael's blade took its head off in one clean stroke. The body collapsed, black blood pooling in the pine needles. But instead of staying down, it began to twitch and convulse. The severed head rolled toward its body, and Kael watched in horror as dark tendrils began to emerge from the neck stump, reaching for the missing piece like grasping fingers. "Silver slows them down," the child said conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather. "But it doesn't stop them. Nothing stops them except the master's will." Two more thralls rushed him from opposite sides, their movements perfectly coordinated despite their apparent clumsiness. Kael spun, his blade carving a silver arc through the air. He caught one across the chest, opening it from shoulder to hip. But the creature barely slowed. Its claws raked across his ribs, tearing through leather and flesh like paper. Pain flared along his side, hot and immediate. But it was nothing compared to the horror of watching the wounded thrall continue its attack, black ichor pouring from the gaping wound, but showing no signs of weakness or pain. Whatever animated these creatures, it wasn't life as he understood it. Kael rolled away from the second attacker, coming up in a crouch. His wolf was howling for release, wanting to shift and fight with fang and claw. But he'd learned long ago that sometimes human cunning was more valuable than animal instinct. The thralls circled him like a pack, but their movements were too coordinated, too perfect. They moved as one mind controlling multiple bodies, which meant Kael's eyes snapped to the child, who was watching the fight with obvious delight. She wasn't just a messenger, she was the conduit. The focal point through which whatever controlled these creatures was directing their actions. He feinted left, drawing the thralls in that direction, then suddenly pivoted and sprinted toward the child. She had just enough time to look surprised before his blade pierced her chest, sliding between ribs with the wet sound of metal parting flesh. The effect was immediate. Every thrall in the clearing collapsed like puppets with their strings cut, their bodies hitting the ground with dull thuds that echoed through the forest. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on the forest lifted, and somewhere in the distance, Kael heard the sound of normal night creatures beginning to stir. But his victory was short-lived. The child looked down at the silver blade, protruding from her chest, then back up at Kael with those horrible black eyes. "That tickled," she said, her voice now carrying harmonics that made his teeth ache. Then she grabbed the blade with both hands and pulled, driving it deeper into her own body until the hilt pressed against her ribs. Black blood poured from the eye wound, but instead of weakening her, it seemed to make her stronger. The veins beneath her skin grew darker, more pronounced, and her smile became something that belonged in nightmares. "The master wants to meet you properly now," she whispered, her voice multiplying until it sounded like a dozen children speaking in unison. "He's coming. And when he arrives, you'll understand why the old wolves used to whisper his name in the dark." The child's body began to dissolve, not into ash or dust, but into shadow itself. The darkness spread outward like spilled ink, swallowing. The collapsed thralls and creeping toward Kael with hungry tendrils. Where it touched, the very ground seemed to wither and die, leaving behind patches of earth so barren they looked like scars on the world itself. He ran. Behind him, The shadow laughed with the voice of every wolf that had ever died screaming, and the forest itself seemed to bend and twist as something ancient and terrible began to wake. Trees groaned and cracked, their branches reaching toward him like grasping claws. The very air grew thick and oppressive, making each breath a struggle. Kael burst from the tree line and sprinted toward the pack house, his enhanced speed carrying him across the village in seconds. But even as he ran, he could feel eyes watching him from every shadow, and he knew with cold certainty that whatever was coming for Ironridge was far beyond anything he'd ever faced. The silver pendant at his throat grew warm, then hot. The king's emergency beacon. But Kael didn't break it. Not yet. He had a feeling that before this night was over, he was going to need all the help he could get, and in the darkness behind him, something that had slept for 1,000 years began to stretch and yawn, and remember what it meant to hunt. The real battle was just beginning. The ancient evil reveals itself. What is this master that commands the dead? Find out in Chapter 3. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the shocking revelation. Chapter 3. Blood of the Moon. Kael barely made it back to the pack house before the screaming started. Not human screaming. Something far worse. The very air itself seemed to shriek as reality bent and twisted around whatever was approaching through the forest. Windows cracked in perfect spiderweb patterns. The ground trembled with a rhythm. That felt almost like a heartbeat, deep and slow and utterly wrong, and every wolf in the building, including Kael, felt their animals cower in primal terror. The pack house itself seemed to react to the approaching presence. Ancient wooden beams groaned and creaked as if the building were in pain. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that frost began forming on the inside of the windows, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. Even the flames in the fireplace guttered and dimmed, as if the very concept of warmth was being drained from the world. "What's happening?" Elderthorn demanded as Kael burst through the door, his clothes torn and bloody from his encounter with the thralls. The old wolf's voice was steady, but his hands shook as he reached for a weapon that would be useless against what was coming. "We need to leave. Now." Kael's voice was sharp with urgency, but even as he spoke, he could see the futility in their eyes. Where could they go? How could they outrun something that commanded the very shadows? "Whatever's coming, this place won't protect us." But even as he spoke, he knew it was too late. The temperature in the room plummeted further, and their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. Frost spread across the windows in patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed from the corner of the eye. Geometric. Designs that spoke of alien intelligence and purposes, beyond human comprehension. The children huddled closer to their mothers, their young faces pale with a fear they couldn't name but instinctively understood. The warriors gripped their weapons tighter, though they all knew that steel and silver would be of little use against what approached. Even the pack house's protective wards, carved into the doorframes and windowsills by generations of shamans, began to smoke and crack under the pressure of the approaching presence. Then the voice came, not from outside but from everywhere at once, as if the very walls were speaking. It resonated through the building structure, making the floorboards vibrate and the ceiling beams sing with harmonic frequencies that made everyone's teeth ache. "There is nowhere to run, little wolves. Nowhere to hide. I am the shadow between shadows, the hunger that devours light itself. I am what your ancestors feared when they first learned to howl at the moon." One of the children began to cry, a soft whimpering that seemed impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. The sound was quickly stifled by her mother's hand, but the damage was done. The presence outside had heard, and its attention focused on them like the gaze of a predator selecting its prey. Kael moved to the center of the room, placing himself between the survivors and whatever was coming. His silver blade felt inadequate in his hand, but it was all he had. Around him, the pack's remaining warriors formed a protective circle, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were about to face something beyond their understanding. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice carrying the authority of the royal guard despite the fear that clawed at his chest. "What do you want?" Laughter echoed through the building. Not the innocent giggle of the possessed child, but something ancient and malevolent that made the wooden beams groan in protest. It was the sound of civilizations falling, of hope dying, of everything good and pure in the world being slowly consumed by an endless hunger. I am Malachar, first of the Voidborn, spawn of the dark moon that rises once every 1,000 years. I am the reason your kind learned to fear the darkness. And what I want, Broken Beta, is what I have always wanted, to feed. The front wall of the pack house simply disappeared. Not destroyed or broken down, but erased as if it had never existed. The protective wards that had been carved into its surface vanished with it, leaving behind only empty air and the scent of ozone. In the gap stood a figure that defied description. At first glance, Malachar appeared to be a tall, elegant man in dark robes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But the longer Kael looked, the more wrong details emerged. His skin was too pale, with a translucent quality that revealed the absence of blood beneath. His hair was white as bone and moved as if underwater, defying the still air around him. And his eyes were holes in reality itself, windows into a void so complete that looking into them made Kael's mind recoil in self-preservation. They weren't just black. They were the absence of everything, including the concept of existence itself. Staring into them was like looking into the space between stars, the emptiness that existed before creation and would remain after everything else had crumbled to dust. But it was the aura of wrongness that surrounded him that truly marked him as something that should not exist. The air around Malachar rippled like heat waves, but instead of warmth, it radiated a cold so profound it seemed to leach the life from everything it touched. Where his feet touched the ground, the wooden floor blackened and began to rot. The very atoms of reality seemed to recoil from his presence. Magnificent, isn't he? The voice came from behind them. Kael spun to find the possessed child standing in the room, though he was certain she hadn't been there moments before. Her wound had healed, leaving only a silver scar across her chest that seemed to pulse with its own dark light. But now he could see her for what she truly was. Not a child at all, but something wearing a child's form like an ill-fitting mask. Luna, Elder Thorn breathed, recognition dawning in his eyes. That's Luna Brightwater. She disappeared 2 nights ago. Luna is gone, the child said with that too-old voice, her words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I am merely wearing her flesh. The Master finds children make the best vessels. Their minds break so much more easily than adults. Less resistance, you understand? The real Luna was still in there somewhere, Kael realized with horror, trapped behind those black eyes, watching helplessly as her body was used for unspeakable purposes. The knowledge made his wolf snarl with protective fury, but there was nothing he could do. The child was already lost. Malachar glided into the room, his feet not quite touching the floor. Where he passed, the wooden planks blackened and cracked, releasing wisps of smoke that smelled of sulfur and decay. You disappoint me, Beta Ashworth. I expected more fight from the king's legendary hunter. The night's still young, Kael replied, though his wolf was screaming at him to submit, to roll over and bare his throat to this apex predator. Every instinct told him he was facing something so far beyond his ability to fight that resistance was not just futile, but actively suicidal. Indeed it is. Malachar's smile revealed teeth like black diamonds, each one perfectly formed but wrong in ways that made the eye want to look away. Tell me, do you know the true history of your kind? The real reason werewolves exist? Kael said nothing, but his grip tightened on his blade. The silver felt warm in his hand, almost alive, as if it were responding to the presence of something it was specifically designed to fight. Your ancestors were not blessed by the moon, as your myths claim. They were marked by it, marked as prey. Malachar began to circle the huddled survivors like a shark scenting blood, his movements hypnotic and predatory. Every 1,000 years when the dark moon rises, I wake to feed. And your kind, with your enhanced life force, your connection to lunar magic, you are the perfect sustenance. Elder Thorn stepped forward, his aged frame trembling, but his voice steady. The old stories speak of you, the Devourer, the shadow that hunts, but they also speak of how you were defeated. Defeated? Malachar laughed, and several windows shattered from the sound, sending glass cascading to the floor like deadly rain. I was never defeated, old wolf. I was merely delayed. The last time I woke, your ancestors managed to wound me, to force me into a deeper sleep. But wounds heal, and sleep ends. He gestured to the possessed child, and she moved to stand beside him with the fluid grace of a predator. This time I was clever. I sent my consciousness ahead, inhabiting the weak-minded and building my strength slowly. By the time I fully manifested, I had already claimed half your pack as thralls. The survivors pressed closer together, their fear a palpable thing in the air. Kael could smell their terror, could hear their hearts racing with panic. But beneath the fear, he sensed something else, a desperate hope that somehow, some way, he would find a way to save them. But you made a mistake, Kael said, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. You revealed yourself too early, showed your hand before you were ready. Malachar's expression darkened, the void black eyes narrowing with something that might have been annoyance. Explain. The message to the king. You wanted me here specifically. But why? If you're as powerful as you claim, why do you need the king's broken beta? Kael took a step forward, ignoring the way the air around Malachar seemed to claw at his skin like invisible talons. You're not at full strength yet. The dark moon hasn't risen. You need something from me. Something you can't just take. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the ancient being's features. It was there and gone in an instant, but Kael caught it. Whatever Malachar was, he wasn't invincible. Not yet. The possessed child hissed, her form beginning to blur around the edges as the thing controlling her grew agitated. Tell him nothing, master. Kill him and be done with it. But Malachar held up one pale hand, the gesture somehow managing to convey both authority and menace. No, he has earned the truth, I think. Those void black eyes fixed on Kael with terrible intensity. You are correct, Beta. I am not yet at full power. The dark moon rises tomorrow night, and when it does, I will be unstoppable. But until then, he gestured, and Kael felt an invisible force slam into him, driving him to his knees. The silver blade clattered across the floor, just out of reach. The force pressing down on him felt like the weight of mountains, crushing and inexorable. Until then, I require a willing sacrifice, someone who chooses to feed my hunger rather than being forced to it. The old magic demands it, a life freely given to complete my resurrection. Kael struggled against the invisible bonds holding him down, but it was like fighting the tide itself. His wolf raged and snarled, but even its supernatural strength was nothing against the power that held him. And you think I'll volunteer? Oh, you will. Malachar's smile was terrible to behold, filled with the certainty of someone who had played this game for millennia. Because if you don't, I will kill every wolf in this room, slowly. And then I will hunt down every pack in the Northern Territories and do the same. Men, women, children, all will feed my hunger until the dark moon rises, and I no longer need willing sacrifice. The survivors behind Kael whimpered in terror, and he felt the weight of their lives pressing down on him like a physical thing. 12 souls. 12 chances for redemption. 12 opportunities to finally save someone instead of failing them. Just like Elena and Marcus, his wolf whispered. Just like your mate and pup. You failed them. And now you'll fail these people too. Kael's voice cracked under the weight of his guilt and the impossible choice before him. I can't save them. I couldn't save anyone. No, Elder Thorn said firmly, struggling to his feet despite his injuries and the oppressive force that seemed to press down on everything in the room. You're wrong, son. You've already saved us once tonight, and you'll do it again. How? Kael looked up at the old wolf with desperate eyes. I'm just one beta against something that's existed for millennia. I'm not strong enough. You're not alone. The voice came from outside, strong and commanding and achingly familiar. Through the gap where the wall had been, a massive figure stepped into view. his presence immediately changing the atmosphere in the room. King Aldrich Blackmane stood silhouetted against the moonlight, his golden eyes blazing with fury that made the air around him shimmer with barely contained power. Behind him came the sound of howls, dozens of them growing closer by the second. The cavalry had arrived, and they were ready for war. "You broke the pendant," Kael breathed, feeling a surge of hope for the first time since this nightmare began. "I felt it activate," Aldrich replied, his gaze never leaving Malachar. "And when an ancient evil threatens my people, I don't send armies." His lips pulled back in a feral grin that promised violence and retribution. "I come myself." Malachar's expression shifted from confidence to something approaching concern. The ancient being had expected to face a broken beta and a handful of survivors. Not the Alpha King himself, backed by the full might of the Royal Guard. The Alpha King. How inconvenient. "For you?" "Yes." Aldrich stepped into the room and the temperature rose noticeably, as if his very presence was pushing back against the unnatural cold. "I know what you are, Devourer. My grandfather's grandfather fought you the last time you woke. He left very detailed records about how to kill you." "Kill me?" Malachar laughed, but there was an edge of hysteria to it now. "I am eternal. I am vulnerable until the dark moon rises," Aldrich finished. "Which gives us approximately 18 hours to end this." The sound of howls grew louder, and through the destroyed wall, Kael could see shapes moving in the forest. Dozens of wolves, all bearing the royal colors. The king hadn't come alone. He'd brought an army, but Malachar wasn't finished. With a gesture, he sent the possessed child flying toward Aldrich, her small form moving with inhuman speed and her fingers extended into claws that could tear through steel. The Alpha King caught her by the throat, his expression sad but determined. "I'm sorry, little one, but you're not in there anymore, are you?" The child's only response was a shriek of rage that shattered every remaining window in the building and sent the survivors scrambling for cover. And as the final battle began, Kael realized that everything, his guilt, his pain, his desperate need for redemption, had led to this moment. The question was, would it be enough? The dark moon was rising and time was running out. The Alpha King arrives. But can even royal power stand against an ancient evil? Don't miss the epic conclusion in Chapter 4. Chapter 4, Blood and Redemption. The battle that followed would be remembered in werewolf lore for generations to come. King Aldrich moved with the fluid grace of a born predator, his massive frame belying his speed as he grappled with the possessed child. But Luna's small body had been enhanced by Malachar's dark magic, giving her strength that rivaled a full-grown alpha and speed that made her nearly impossible to track. Her claws, now extended into razor-sharp talons, carved deep gouges in the Alpha King's armor as they fought. The packhouse became a battlefield in seconds. Royal guards poured through the destroyed wall, their silver weapons gleaming in the moonlight as they engaged the shadow thralls that materialized from every dark corner. The air filled with the sounds of combat, the clash of steel on claw, the snarls of wolves pushed to their limits, the wet sounds of violence that spoke of life and death hanging in the balance. Meanwhile, Kael found himself free as Malachar's attention shifted to the new threat. He rolled toward his fallen blade, snatching it up just as the first of the royal guard burst through the destroyed wall. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were the king's personal guard, each one a veteran of countless battles, each one trained to face supernatural threats that would break lesser wolves. "Protect the survivors," Kael shouted, pointing toward the huddled pack members who were pressed against the far wall. "Get them out of here!" But even as he spoke, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Malachar raised his arms and the very air around them began to thicken and darken. Shadows poured from every corner of the room, coalescing into forms that were almost but not quite wolf-shaped. They moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of the possessed, but these were different from the thralls he'd faced in the forest. These were pure shadow, given form and purpose by Malachar's will. "Shadow thralls," Aldrich grunted, still wrestling with the possessed child. His golden eyes blazed with power as he called upon his royal bloodline, but even his enhanced strength was being tested by Luna's supernatural abilities. They're not alive, so silver won't stop them permanently. You have to disrupt the source. Kael looked around desperately. The source had to be Malachar himself, but the ancient being was protected by a swirling vortex of darkness that seemed to deflect every attack. 3 royal guards had already tried to reach him, only to be flung back by invisible forces that left them broken and bleeding on the floor. The shadow thralls moved like a pack, coordinating their attacks with inhuman precision. They flowed around the royal guards' defenses, striking from unexpected angles and retreating before counterattacks could land. Their claws left trails of darkness in the air, and where they struck, the very light seemed to dim. Then Kael's eyes fell on something that made his blood run cold. Through the chaos of battle, he could see the horizon beginning to lighten. But it wasn't the warm gold of sunrise. It was the sickly silver of the dark moon beginning to rise. The ancient celestial body that appeared only once every 1,000 years was starting its ascent, and with each passing moment, Malachar grew stronger. "We're out of time," he called to Aldrich, dodging a shadow thrall's claws by inches. "The dark moon, I know." The Alpha King finally managed to pin the possessed child, his hands glowing with the golden light of royal magic. But even as he held her down, he could feel her strength increasing. "But I can't break Malachar's hold on her without killing her, and she's just a child." The moral dilemma was tearing at the Alpha King's heart. Luna Brightwater was innocent, a victim of circumstances beyond her control. But with each passing second, the thing controlling her grew stronger, and soon even Aldrich's royal power wouldn't be enough to contain her. That was when Elder Thorn spoke up, his voice cutting through the chaos with surprising strength. Despite his injuries and his age, the old wolf had managed to reach them, moving with the determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. "There is another way. The old stories speak of it. A willing sacrifice can break the bonds of possession." "No," Kael said immediately, understanding what the old wolf was suggesting. He'd already lost too many people tonight, and he wouldn't let another innocent die on his watch. "I won't let you—" "Not me, son." Thorn's eyes were sad but determined, filled with the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to understand the true cost of heroism. You're the one Malachar wants. You're the one whose guilt and pain he's been feeding on. If you offer yourself willingly, truly willingly, with no reservation, it will disrupt his magic long enough for the king to strike. Kael felt the world tilt around him. The old wolf was asking him to commit suicide, to throw away his life on the chance that it might save others. That's suicide. Maybe. Or maybe it's redemption. Thorn gripped his shoulder with surprising strength, his weathered hands steady despite the chaos around them. "You've been carrying the weight of your family's death for 3 years, blaming yourself for following orders instead of following your heart. But tonight, you can choose differently." Around them, the battle raged on. Royal guards fought shadow thralls in a deadly dance, their silver weapons carving through the darkness only to have it reform moments later. The pack house itself was coming apart under the strain of supernatural forces, its ancient timbers groaning and cracking as reality bent around Malachar's presence. And through it all, the dark moon continued its inexorable rise. Already, Kael could feel the change in the air. A heaviness that spoke of ancient power awakening, of barriers between worlds growing thin. Soon Malachar would be at full strength, and then nothing would be able to stop him. Kael looked at the survivors, the women and children who had trusted him to save them, who had placed their faith in a broken beta with nothing left to lose. Then at King Aldrich, who had risked everything to answer his call for help, who had brought the full might of the royal guard to this remote mountain village because he believed in protecting his people. Finally, his gaze settled on the possessed child, Luna Brightwater, whose innocent face was twisted into a mask of supernatural rage. She was still in there somewhere, trapped behind those black eyes, watching helplessly as her body was used for unspeakable purposes. Elena, Marcus, his mate and pup, dead because he'd chosen duty over love. But tonight, he could choose love over duty. Love for his people, his pack, his king. The realization hit him like a physical blow. For 3 years, he'd been carrying the guilt of their deaths, believing that he'd failed them by following orders instead of rushing to their aid. But maybe, just maybe, their deaths had been preparing him for this moment, teaching him that sometimes the greatest act of love was the willingness to sacrifice everything for those who mattered. Malachar, Kael's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, carrying the authority of someone who had finally found his purpose. You want a willing sacrifice? You have one! The ancient being's head snapped toward him, those void black eyes widening with surprise and hunger. The shadow thralls paused in their attacks, and even the royal guard stopped fighting as every eye in the room turned toward the center of the conflict. You would offer yourself freely, knowing that your death will complete my resurrection? Malachar's voice carried a note of disbelief, as if he couldn't quite comprehend that someone would willingly walk into his trap. I offer myself freely, Kael said, and felt a strange peace settle over him like a warm blanket. The constant ache of guilt that had been his companion for 3 years began to fade. Replaced by something he hadn't felt in so long, he'd almost forgotten what it was like. Purpose. But not to complete your resurrection. To end it, he stepped forward, dropping his silver blade. The weapon clattered to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through eternity. Around him, the battle seemed to slow as every eye turned toward the center of the room, toward the broken beta who had finally found his way home. I am Kael Ashworth, beta of the Royal Guard, mate to Elena Moonwhisper, father to Marcus Ashworth. I carry the guilt of their deaths and the weight of every life I've failed to save. I offer my life, my pain, my guilt, all of it, freely given. Malachar's expression shifted from hunger to confusion, his perfect features twisting with something that might have been fear. What are you doing? Something I should have done 3 years ago, Kael replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I'm choosing love over fear. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small silver locket, the only thing that had survived the fire that killed his family. It was tarnished and dented, bearing the scars of that terrible night. But inside was a picture of Elena and Marcus, their faces bright with joy and love. The image was faded now, but their smiles were as radiant as ever. I offer my life not to feed your hunger, but to break the chains that bind the innocent. I offer my death not in despair, but in hope. And I offer my soul not to darkness, but to the light of those I've loved and lost. The locket began to glow with a warm golden light that seemed to push back the shadows. It wasn't the harsh glare of artificial illumination, but something deeper, the light of love freely given, of sacrifice made without reservation, of a soul finally at peace with itself. Malachar recoiled as if burned, his perfect features twisting with rage and fear. The ancient being had expected despair, had fed on guilt and self-hatred for millennia. But this pure expression of love and redemption, was anathema to everything he represented. No, that's not how the magic works. You cannot. I can, Kael said simply, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute truth. Because I'm not offering myself to you. I'm offering myself to them. The golden light spread outward from the locket, washing over the possessed child like a gentle tide. Luna's body convulsed once, twice, then went limp in Aldrich's arms. The black veins beneath her skin faded, and the unnatural pallor gave way to healthy pink. When she opened her eyes again, they were her own natural brown, not the void black of possession. Mama? She whispered, confused and frightened, but blessedly human. Where's my mama? She's safe, little one, Aldrich said gently, cradling the child protectively in his arms. You're safe now, Malachar screamed, a sound like reality tearing apart at the seams, like the death cry of a universe collapsing in on itself. His carefully maintained human form began to dissolve, revealing the writhing mass of shadow and hunger beneath. The elegant robes fell away to reveal something that defied description, a constantly shifting amalgamation of darkness and malice that hurt to look at directly. You have ruined everything, he shrieked, his voice now a cacophony of tortured souls and dying stars. 1,000 years of planning, destroyed by one broken beta's misguided nobility. Not broken, Aldrich said, rising to his feet with Luna cradled protectively in his arms. His golden eyes blazed with the full power of his royal bloodline, and the air around him shimmered with barely contained energy. Redeemed. The Alpha King's eyes blazed with golden fire as he called upon the full power of his royal bloodline, not just his own strength, but the accumulated might of every Alpha King who had come before him. The ancient magic of the crown, passed down through generations of rulers who had sworn to protect their people, flowed through him like molten gold. By the authority of the moon herself, by the blood of the first Alphas, by the sacred duty to protect the pack, I banish you, Malachar, back to the void that spawned you. Royal magic, ancient and pure, slammed into the dissolving form of the Devourer. But instead of destroying him, it seemed to be pulling him apart, unraveling the very essence that held him together. The shadow thralls throughout the room began to dissolve as well, their forms losing cohesion as their master's power waned. This isn't over. Malachar's voice was fading, becoming distant and hollow as he was pulled back into whatever dark dimension had spawned him. I will return. When the next dark moon rises, I will. In another 1,000 years, Aldrich said calmly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a king who had just saved his people. And we'll be ready. The last of Malachar's form dissolved into shadow. Then even the shadows faded as the first rays of true dawn broke over the mountains. The dark moon, robbed of its power by Kael's sacrifice, set without completing its rise. The ancient cycle had been broken, the resurrection prevented by an act of pure love. Kael collapsed to his knees, the golden light fading from the locket. He felt empty. Not in a bad way, but like a weight he'd carried for so long had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The constant ache of guilt was gone, replaced by something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Peace. The pack house, damaged but still standing, began to fill with the sounds of normal life returning. Birds began to sing outside. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on the forest lifted. Even the air tasted cleaner, as if the very atmosphere had been purified by what had just transpired. Is it over? Elderthorn asked, his voice barely a whisper. The old wolf looked like he'd aged a decade in the past few hours, but his eyes were bright with hope. It's over, Aldrich confirmed, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. He knelt beside Kael, studying the beta with concern. How do you feel? Kael considered the question seriously, taking inventory of his emotional state for the first time in years. The crushing guilt was gone. The constant ache of loss had faded to a manageable sadness. For the first time since Elena and Marcus had died, he felt like he could breathe freely. Free, he said finally. For the first time in 3 years, I feel free. Good. The Alpha King helped him to his feet, his grip strong and supportive. Because I have a feeling the Northern Territories are going to need a strong leader to help them rebuild. Someone who understands loss and redemption. Kael looked around at the survivors. No longer just survivors, but the foundation of a new beginning. Luna was being comforted by her mother, who had emerged from the forest with the other missing pack members, all of them freed from Malachar's influence by his sacrifice. The royal guards were already beginning the work of securing the area and tending to the wounded. I'm just a beta, Kael said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they were no longer true. Something fundamental had changed in him during the confrontation with Malachar. He was no longer the broken wolf who had arrived in Ironridge. You're the beta who faced down an ancient evil and won, Aldrich replied, his voice carrying the weight of royal authority. You're the wolf who chose love over fear, hope over despair. That makes you exactly what these people need. As the sun rose fully over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Kael felt something he hadn't experienced since the night his family died. Hope for the future. The Northern Territories would rebuild. The Ironridge pack would grow strong again. And somewhere in the distance, he could swear he heard the sound of familiar laughter. Elena and Marcus, finally at peace, finally proud of the choice he'd made. The hunt was over. The healing could begin. New beginnings. 6 months later. The new Ironridge pack house stood proud against the mountain skyline, its walls strong and its windows bright with warm light. Built from local stone and timber, it was larger than the old building, designed to accommodate not just the original survivors, but the dozens of wolves who had come to join the growing pack. The architecture blended traditional werewolf design with modern conveniences, creating a space that honored the past while embracing the future. Inside, the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air as the pack gathered for their weekly feast. The great hall was warm and welcoming, its walls decorated with tapestries that told the story of their survival and rebirth. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows that no longer held any terror for those who had faced true darkness and emerged victorious. Kael stood at the head of the table, no longer the broken beta who had arrived in their darkest hour, but Alpha Kael Ashworth, leader of the Northern Territories and protector of all who called the mountains home. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken months of hard work, of learning to lead rather than simply follow orders, of building trust with wolves who had every reason to fear authority figures. But he had persevered, guided by the memory of Elena and Marcus, and the knowledge that he was finally living up to the man they had believed him to be. The guilt was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose that grew stronger with each passing day. Luna Brightwater, now fully recovered from her ordeal and growing into a confident young wolf, tugged at his sleeve. She had become something of a mascot for the pack, her survival a symbol of hope and resilience that inspired everyone around her. "Alpha Kael, will you tell us the story again? About the night you saved us all?" Kael smiled, ruffling her hair with the easy affection of someone who had learned to love again. "Which part would you like to hear?" "The part where you chose love over fear," she said solemnly, her young face serious with the weight of someone who had seen darkness and chosen light. "I like that part best." "So do I," Kael admitted, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had finally found peace. "So do I." As the pack settled in to hear their favorite tale, Kael caught sight of his reflection in the window. The scars were still there, the memories of loss still real. But they no longer defined him. He was no longer the king's broken beta, carrying guilt like a burden too heavy to bear. He was Alpha Kael Ashworth, leader of the Northern Territories, protector of the innocent, and guardian of the light that had been kindled in the darkness of that terrible night. And for the first time in 3 years, he had finally come home. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and watchful, their peaks touched with snow that gleamed like silver in the moonlight. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the wind, came the sound of wolves singing to the moon, not in fear or sorrow, but in joy and celebration of life renewed. The end. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the Northern Territories. If you enjoyed this epic tale of redemption and supernatural warfare, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more amazing werewolf stories. What did you think of Kael's transformation from broken beta to alpha leader? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget, there are more stories waiting in the shadows. Until next time, keep howling at the moon.